started at lab number 4.
Okay, so we're going to start with the arterial system. We'll start from the heart. So here is the ascending aorta, and then we have the aortic arch, and you can tell when you're at the arch because you can see those 3 vessels attached. And then as we're going around, remember that candy cane shape. This was the short part of the candy cane, and then the curve, the long part of the candy cane would be going posterior to the heart. So that would be the descending aorta, or as we'd refer to it here in the thoracic cavity, the thoracic aorta. Okay? We'll start following these 3 branches at this point. So the 3 branches from the aortic arch are the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. Okay, so we'll start with the brachiocephalic artery. The brachiocephalic artery is going to come up this way, posterior to where these veins are, and it's going to divide into 2 branches. One of the branches is going to head up into the neck. That one is the right common carotid. The other one is going to head toward the upper limb, and that's going to be the right subclavian. Now this vessel, this right subclavian, is going to be very short because it's going to pass the first rib and then its name is going to change. Okay, so once you're past the first rib, the vessel keeps going, but the name changes, and the name is now the axillary artery. Okay, and the vessel keeps going, but it gets past the epiphyseal plate here in the humerus at the proximal end, and now it's by the diaphysis of the humerus, and that's where we'd call it the brachial artery. Okay, and then the brachial artery will continue down to the elbow, and at the elbow it will divide into 2 branches. The one that goes to the thumb side is the radial artery. The one that goes to the pinky side will be the ulnar artery. Okay? We have the exact same situation on the left of the left common carotid. Okay, and we'll talk about the branches of the carotid artery on another model. And then we have the left subclavian artery. This one will be a little longer since it has an attachment to the aorta. So you'll have a left subclavian artery here until you get to the first rib, and then axillary, then brachial, and then ulnar and radial, which are harder to see on this side because they've got the arm in a different position. Okay? All right, so let's come back to the heart here. We'll pass the aortic arch. We'll go through the thoracic aorta, and we'll just kind of imagine that we're following it along. And here at the diaphragm, we can pick up the aorta again as the abdominal aorta. And then we're going to see the abdominal aorta split into 2 branches. Those are the common iliac arteries. And each common iliac artery will split into 2 branches, which are the external and internal. Okay, external meaning it's staying superficial, internal meaning it's heading deeper. Okay, so you can see the internal heading right here into the pelvic cavity. Okay, the external, we're going to follow on this side, is going to pass the ilium and get out into the leg, and then its name is going to change once it passes the edge of the hip bones. There's a big ligament there called the inguinal ligament that it will pass next to or under, and it will head down by the femur, so then it will be the femoral artery, and then it'll head into the posterior knee, okay, most of it, and it will become the popliteal, because this is the popliteal fossa, and then it will divide into 2 main branches, one that goes posterior to the tibia and the other that goes anterior to the tibia, And I guess you can probably guess the one posterior to the tibia is going to be the posterior tibial artery. The one that goes anterior to the tibia is going to be the anterior tibial artery. Okay? As you can see, there are a lot more arteries on this representation, but we're only doing the arteries that I specifically mentioned. Okay? Now, as far as veins, again, we'll start from the heart. Okay, so we have the superior vena cava here, and this isn't the best representation, but they're trying to show you that there's one part of a Y here and another part of the Y that are both leading into the superior vena cava, and these are the brachiocephalic veins. Okay, and each brachiocephalic vein divides into an internal jugular, which is carrying venous blood from the brain, and a subclavian. Okay, so we have the same situation on this side, internal jugular and subclavian vein. Okay, and like what we saw with the arteries, the subclavian vein is the name between the brachiocephalic and the first rib. After that, it would be the axillary vein. By the diaphysis of the humerus, it would be the brachial vein. And then the main branches that you have near the radial and ulnar arteries would be the radial and ulnar veins. Okay, you also have a diagonal arrangement of the vein here, which is the median cubital vein. Okay. Now, on the opposite side of the heart, we have the inferior vena cava. And situation's going to be the same with the veins here as we had with the arteries. Common iliacs, external iliacs, internal iliacs, a femoral vein, which has been cut off on this model, a popliteal vein, which also is not visible, but in an anterior and posterior tibial vein, which again are not represented here. What is represented very nicely is this very long vein here, which is the longest vein in the body, and it's the great saphenous vein. Okay. All right, so that's kind of an overview. Let's go to some other models where we can see some specific vessels in specific areas. So here we're looking at the common carotid that we saw earlier, and it's coming, you can see it divides about here into two branches. The one that stays superficial is the external carotid. You can see the external carotid has a lot of little branches on it because it's supplying the soft tissues of the lateral and some of the anterior and posterior, even head and neck. Okay, and then you have the larger portion, which doesn't really have any branches, and that is the internal carotid. And the internal carotid passes through the carotid canal that we looked at back in A&P 1, and it emerges on the inside of the skull through that passageway to contribute to the circle of Willis. Okay, we're going to switch over to this side for a second. Okay, and you have a nice shot actually of both of the vertebral arteries here, both the right and the left. And you can see they're in the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. That's why those vertebrae have those little openings in their transverse processes, is to make a tunnel for the vertebral artery, which is what this red vessel represents. So both of the vertebral arteries are going to come into the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum. And so here's one and here's the other. And then they're going to fuse together to make this single artery, which is the basilar artery. Okay, and the combination of the carotids anteriorly and the vertebral basilar system posteriorly is what brings blood to that important arterial anastomosis, the circle of Willis. Okay. All right, let's move on to this model. Okay, and again, we'll start up here near the heart. We had the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, the thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta, and then common iliac arteries, external iliac arteries, and then heading medially the internal iliac arteries. Okay, and the veins are right next to them for all of these. Okay, common iliac vein, internal iliac vein, external iliac vein. Okay, now on this model you can actually see that ligament that I mentioned, the inguinal ligament here and here. Okay, so this is your landmark kind of as the border between where you would call it an iliac, an external iliac, and where you would call it a femoral. Once you go out of the body cavity and into the leg, then the name changes to the femoral artery and vein. Okay, and then the femoral part of it is going to dive down deep into an opening between the adductors here and the femur called the adductor hiatus. Turn this around. And when the artery emerges from the other side through that opening, it's in the popliteal fossa in the posterior nape, so we would call it the popliteal artery here. Okay, and then the popliteal will divide into the posterior tibial and I don't have it on this one, but the anterior tibial would be in here. Okay. Now if we go to the top part of this model, again, where the branches of the aortic arch are, this would be the brachiocephalic artery here, where it's dividing into the right common carotid, and the right subclavian would be back in here. You can't see it too well on this model. And then you can also see the left common carotid here, and you can actually from this side see the right common carotid coming right up the side of the neck, going toward the head. Okay. Again, you can't see the subclavian too well here. The left subclavian is starting here at the aortic arch. It's coming here. Here's the rib right here. So once we get past the first rib, it becomes the axillary. And as we're getting out into the arm, which would be out here somewhere, missing in action, it would be the brachial. Okay. Here's the superior vena cava. This is a better representation of the brachiocephalic vein, so you can see clearly that there's two vessels, kind of a Y-like structure leading to the superior vena cava. And then you can also see nicely the internal jugular and the subclavian joining to form that brachiocephalic vein. And that would be the same again on both sides.